What does it actually mean to know something? How do you know science gives us truth? And here's a harder question. How would you prove that scientifically? What if I told you that every scientific discovery you trust, well, it depends on things science itself can't prove. Logic, truth, even the reliability of your own mind. So when someone says, trust the science, what are they really asking you to trust? Hi all, I'm Lenny Esposito, and on this episode, we're going to uncover one of the most common and the most dangerous assumptions in our culture. This idea that science is all we need to rely upon to discover what's real about our world. Now, we'll find out why that statement itself commits intellectual suicide. You see, it isn't that using science is wrong, but the assumption that it's enough really cripples one from discovering real truths that science can never touch. Christianity, however, holds a much more robust explanation of truth, and we were going to explore all of this coming up on this Come Let Us Reason Together. Well, hi again, everyone. Welcome back to another Come Let Us Reason Together. I hope you're set to enjoy a time with me that might be a little bit deep thinking, a little bit of provocative ideas, but something that's really, really important. Because as I see it today, what's been happening is more and more people have assumed that since science has given us so much, and it is true that we have made great strides in being able to control our environment, control our agriculture, and even control the things that we wear and build through different scientific discoveries. But the problem is people have seen those kinds of growths, and they assume then that science really surpasses all other types of knowing. In fact, I talk with a lot of skeptics who tell me that science is the only way that you can truly know something. And that's a little bit of a problem. Now, this isn't a discussion simply confined to, say, internet engagement. It happens on actually even the highest levels of academia. Just shortly before his death, the famous physicist Stephen Hawking, along with his co-author Leonard Mlodinow, published a book entitled The Grand Design. And even there, they made this grandiose claim, and it prefaces with this quote: "We each exist but for a short time, and in that time explore but a small part of the whole universe. But humans are a curious species. We wonder, we seek answers. Living in this vast world that is by turns kind and cruel, and gazing at the immense heavens above, people have always asked a multitude of questions. How can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator?" Most of us do not spend most of our time worrying about these questions, but almost all of us worry about them some of the time. I think that that statement is absolutely fair, and I think that it's proper for Hawking and Mlodinow to bring that up. The problem is what they say next. I'll go on. He writes, "Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge." Well, that is a huge statement. Of course, one of the problems that Hawking faces when making such a statement is he's not doing science and saying philosophy is dead and science is the bearer of the torch of knowledge. He's actually doing philosophy. And that brings us to why this is such an important topic. Because people haven't thought about what knowledge actually is. I mean, how would you define knowledge? How do we know something is true as opposed to just believe something is true? What's the difference? What qualifies a fact as a fact? What qualifies something as being known as opposed to just something being felt or being assumed? How does Hawking know that philosophy is dead? How is he proving that? How does Hawking know that science is providing even the right answers? I mean, it could be that we are in a grand simulation. Maybe, we are simply stuck in the Matrix, if you remember the 1990s movies. We're all basically brains in a vat. What if our reality is just an illusion? What if we're hooked up to a supercomputer? And in that supercomputer, we think we're living in a three-dimensional real world. We think we're walking down the street. We think that we're driving our car or going to work. But really, we're all in pods. We're all just energy cells. And we're all there in order to help the computer survive. This was the plot line of The Matrix. This is how the film opened. And you have to ask the question that if you watch that movie, they had scientists in the Matrix world, right? They had people who believed that they were doing science, but they weren't really doing science. They weren't really running experiments. These were all virtual feeds, something that was giving them their sensory inputs, something that was giving them all of the smells, tastes, touch, feels, all of those empirical data points that science relies upon. Those were simulated by a computer. And the question is, did the science in the world of the Matrix make sense to those who were trapped within that system? Does the science in the world of the virtual reality machine follow? Now, we're familiar with AI. AI has grown by leaps and bounds today. And when AI provides an answer, it sounds convincing, even though that answer may not be true. And sometimes you have to say, I'm sorry, AI, that answer is false. You have to do it again. And then the computer will come back and say, oh, yes, you're right, that's false. And they may spit you out something else that's just as false. But unless you have something external against to compare it, you have no idea. So, was the truth inside the Matrix true? Was their truth about the world true? Would their science contradict the true reality of their world? And if not, then how do they know that they're not in the Matrix? Or how do we know we aren't? If we claim to know things that science is, if we claim to know that all the things that science tells us is true, we're in a bad situation, because the first prospect of science is to try and disprove what has come before. So, we claim to know things that science is inept to discover. As Christians, we understand not merely the supernatural. That's, easy, and that's dismissed by a lot of people, but there's other items, there's other ideas, there are other facts of life, there are other truths that we can know that science has no ability to discern. Think about certain questions like this. How do you know certain things are right or wrong, moral or immoral? How can science prove morality of something? Torturing children for fun is wrong, for example. It can tell you probably good ways to do so. It can tell you how much pain something may inflict, but it can't tell you whether it's right or wrong. What about personal experience questions such as, do I exist right now? Or am I in pain right now? Am I dreaming right now? Those are some of the kinds of things that science can't tell you. How about laws of logic? The laws of logic themselves are important for us to discern everything else. Matter of fact, science relies upon the laws of logic in order to progress in its way in ruling out bad answers and ruling out untruthful facts, and in showing bias maybe in its data points. So it can't test the laws of logic if it's using the laws of logic to determine whether other things are true. So there's a lot of misunderstanding in all of this, and that's why I think it's important to understand what knowledge is, what it means to discover what truth is, and how we can know that things that we know, and why knowing is important. So this is where we're going to go today. We're going to look a little bit at a branch of philosophy called epistemology, understanding what knowledge is, how we understand it, what it requires, what it doesn't require, because there's a lot of misunderstandings there. And we'll take a deep dive into this and then apply it to our faith questions as much as to our science questions. So, first of all, let's talk about knowledge. How do you understand what knowledge is? Well, there's several things. There's actually three aspects or three parts to knowledge. And the first thing is a belief. You have to at least start with a belief. If you don't have a belief, you can't know something. Let me give you an example. So I'm going to put on the screen a statement. This is a true sentence, if I tell you it's true. This is a sentence written in Chinese, though. Now, if you don't read Chinese, can you tell me whether that statement is true or false? Well, you don't have any belief one way or the other. You have no idea what those characters mean, right? You can have a positive belief. You can say that statement is true. Or you can have a negative belief, say that statement is false. But most people would just be neutral on this and say, I have no idea. I have no idea what it says. I have no idea what it's even about. So I don't believe it's true. I don't believe it's false. I'm withholding my belief. So you can't know whether the statement is true or false unless at least you have a belief of it, right? So belief is the first piece of our knowledge puzzle. You have to believe it. If something is true and you don't believe it, then you've got a bigger problem. So that's the first thing. So again, and when we talk about these kinds of ideas, negative beliefs and positive beliefs are still beliefs. So we can talk about the nature of reality can only be discovered through science. That's a positive belief. You're saying that this is one thing that I believe, right? You're putting it in a positive light. Or you can have a negative belief, say philosophy is dead. But you must believe one way or the other in these kinds of things. In order to have a belief, your belief must be either positive or negative. So that's the first thing. Knowledge requires a belief. But it also requires truth. Knowledge, in order for something to be known, it must be a true belief. Now, that means in order to know something, there must be something to know. Okay? And what we talk about when we talk about truth, it gets a little bit more complicated because philosophers have actually divided on this point. And what you'll find is people today also really don't understand how truth is discerned. So if we have knowledge is considered a justified true belief, and what makes something true. So let's talk about three different views of truth that people will walk down. First is the pragmatic theory of truth. And this is something that I think a lot of people hold to when they just want their way. I'm kidding a little bit because there is an actual sophisticated philosophical position called the pragmatic theory of truth. And it basically says a statement is true if it allows you to interact effectively and efficiently with the cosmos, if it works for you. This theory of truth basically denies that there's any out there objective type of truth. All truth is kind of created by the individual as he sees it. And as we call something true, as long as, my ends are accomplished by what I want to do. Okay, I believe that I have $10 in the bank. I go to my ATM machine, ask to get $10 out. It does that. So my belief is true because I've accomplished my goal. Now that in an objective case, maybe it is true that you had $10 in the bank. Maybe the ATM machine, failed. Or maybe you believed you had $10 in the bank and the ATM machine said your account's empty. It doesn't matter. But what the pragmatic theory says is the less true a belief is, the less it facilitates such interaction. So again, this is a relativistic kind of truth. This is just whether it works or not. And a belief is considered false if it facilitates no interaction whatsoever. If you can't do anything, then you know that it's not true, right? So for example, there's a common idea that if you flash your lights as you're driving up to a traffic signal, the signal will change green for you. And this is the kind of idea where you try flashing your lights, light doesn't change. So obviously this is a false belief because it doesn't accomplish what I want it to accomplish. And that's the only measuring stick I'm using. Lucky charms, rituals, things like that, if they achieve those points, and this is why certain rituals and certain superstitions continue, because people will see that they did this ritual and then they see a result that they were hoping for, and they conflate the two and say, well, A was the cause of B. It's true that I got this because of that, since that happened. But this is the problem, is that it's not as objective as it would be. You have these different ambiguities that can come up. And of course, the biggest problem in this pragmatic theory of truth is from a moral position. We get moral relativism from it, right? Is it right or wrong to cheat on your taxes, let's say? What's the best, what's the ethical thing to do? Well, if it works for you and you don't get caught, then maybe it's right. If it's good for me, then it's good for me. And that's what we start to see over and over again. So this pragmatic theory of truth is just basically, how does life play out in the world? It doesn't take into account any objective standard outside of itself. That's the pragmatic theory of truth. Now, there's also the coherence theory of truth. The coherence theory of truth is a little bit broader than the pragmatic theory, and it says a belief is true if it's logically consistent or if it aligns with other beliefs that are also understood to be true. So basically, if I can amass a whole bunch of statements all together and they all seem to be true, then my belief is true. And a belief is false if it contradicts other beliefs that are held to be true. Now, the problem with this is that we have claims that are inconsistent with other beliefs that we should hold, and others that we should be considered doubtful or unlikely to be true. So, for example, we don't primarily believe magic works because it contradicts so many of our other beliefs. This would be the cohesive theory of truth, right? We have all these beliefs about how the world works, and magic has a power that doesn't seem to match. But with a cohesive theory of truth, you run into all kinds of other things. For example, quantum physics is a primary example where it doesn't obey any of the laws or any of the expectations that we have. Yet when we measure it, we get results that seem to confirm some of these different aspects of quanta and how they interrelate even across vast spaces of the universe. The biggest problem with the cohesion theory is that it relies on us to be basically all-knowing ahead of time. If we don't have all the facts, it's easy for us to be taken asunder. The third theory is the theory that I think most Christians should hold, although many of them are either pragmatic or in one of the other camps. This is the correspondence theory of truth. And what this theory of truth says is a claim is true if it corresponds to what actually is the case. In other words, there's a real truth out there. There's a real fact of the way things are in the universe, regardless of whether you know it or not, regardless of whether you believe it or not, regardless of whether you like it or not. There's an objective case. And what our goal is as truth seekers is we're trying to discover it. We're just trying to say, I want my beliefs to align with the way things actually are out in the real world. And a belief is false if it does not correspond to what is so. So let's take the belief God exists. Now, of the three theories, only the correspondence theory forces such a belief to be either true or false. The pragmatic theory can say, well, I pray and I got my result, so God must be true. And you go, okay, well, that may be just dumb luck, right? Or I prayed and I didn't get my result. Well, maybe God has other plans for you. So the pragmatic theory doesn't force you to believe either true or false. You can do so, but you can also excuse it. The cohesion theory, it really believes on how you understand God to work in the world. Does the God of the universe, is he a deistic God? Did he just wind up the universe and then walk away? The Allah supernatural, Sam and Dean are always trying to deal with the fact that God seems to have left the world in quite a mess. But that's why they didn't believe in God. They dismissed him because they saw the mess that was there. But the correspondence theory of truth says that either God is there or he's not there, and you have to make a choice. It's either true or false that God exists. There's no in between on this one. He either exists or he doesn't, right? He can't be both existing and non-existing at the same time. And whether or not you believe it has no effect on whether God is actually out there. So the correspondence theory of truth is the one that relates man with God. And of all three theories, only the correspondence theory really relies upon an objective nature to reality, a real truth. And that's really important because the pragmatic theory, that's kind of a me-centered theory on truth, right? I just want it to be true the way I understand or I experience the world. And the coherence theory is actually kind of me-centered as well when you think about it, because it's based on whatever your other beliefs that you hold are true to be. You're just amassing in kind of a pooling of ideas, and you're holding on to those. So the correspondence theory is a cosmos-centered or a God-centered theory. In other words, if God thinks that the universe is really existing, if it's a three-dimensional, material, physical place, then it's a three-dimensional material place. It's not a computer simulation. So for the Christian, God grounds correspondence truth. God grounds the truth of reality because God exists, because there is an outside source that is existing and that shows us that there's an objective way to the way the world is, aside from what, even if every human on the planet believes A, if God holds to B and he created the world in B, then B is the way the world actually is. Now, in all of this, I say this to tell you that science actually relies on the correspondence theory of truth to discover things. It believes that there is a world out there that's willing to discover. And this is Christianity's great advancement of science. This is why the scientific enterprise flourished in the West, because the West was Christian and they held the idea that not only is there a way the world is out there, it held that God is a God of order and he would have created a world of order. And then they point to the scriptures like it is the glory of God to conceal a matter. It is the glory of man to find that matter out. So we believe that God allows us to discover those truths that he knows about the world and to use them, right? Even in the book of Genesis, when God tells Adam that he's created all these things and that you are to till the garden, you are to keep it. The implication there is to discover its secrets, find out how it works, and use it to your benefit. And it's not to abuse it. I'm going to be very careful here because it's the idea of exploring creation means we also have to be good stewards of creation. We explore and we learn it in order to save it as much as instead of to just waste it. But in all of that, we are to use creation and for the glory of God, discover these things that he has done. And to tell you the truth, in the last 25 to 50 years, I think that's been really the main storyline of science. As we look at DNA, as we look at gene sequencing, as we look at the remarkable molecular machines in the cell, we continually are amazed at the intricacy, at the level of detail and sophistication that we see within creation. And the more we find it, the more in awe we should become. So, in order for something to have knowledge, you have to have a belief. That belief has to be true. It can't be a false belief and be considered knowledge. You would just be making a mistake. But there's a third aspect in order for something to be classified as knowledge. It can't simply be a true belief. It has to be a justified true belief. So let me give you an example. One may hold to true beliefs without having knowledge. And I've used this before, and you can see how both in the pragmatic theory and the cohesive theory where this exercise, where this thought experiment would be maybe proven true, but in the correspondence theory of truth, it falls short. So imagine you have a Aboriginal, a pre modern civilization individual who's living out in the wild. And this specific tribe has a very, they have some kind of genetic abnormality, although they don't know that, but they are very susceptible to heart disease. And they're also very susceptible because their diets and the things like that. They eat a lot of blubber in their location. Because of all of this, they gain a lot of weight, and they're susceptible to heart disease, so they die. Well, they start to invoke their local gods, and they believe that they have to, in order to escape death. Death is like an invisible tiger who chases after them. And in order to escape death, they have to each day run at least 3 miles as fast as they can. Through the day, they have to run as fast as they can. And what will happen is that the tiger demon will be tired after that every day, and they will be able to have a long life. Now, you can hold to that view. And guess what happens? If you run 3 miles a day, you lose weight, your heart gets stronger, and you don't die, right? So they have a true belief in running every day for that distance and exercising in that way. They are going to sustain their life much longer and much more. It's much more likely that they will live longer than someone who doesn't do so, some of their relatives or something like that. But that's not a true belief. You see, but without understanding the facts of cardiovascular systems, of plaque in the different hearts and all this stuff, if you don't understand that, you can still have this belief, and the result is the same, but we know it's not a true belief. So it's not a justified belief. They have a true belief about living and how to live in order to prolong their lives, but they're missing something. They're missing proper justification, because the things that they're saying they are accomplishing through that action are actually not true. So justification assumes adequate reasons for something. I know that exercise reduces fat because exercise burns calories stored in the body's fat cells, right? I know other things. I can know that I'm teaching right now. I have justification to believe that what I'm doing is recording this podcast. I can tell from the location. I can tell that I'm alive. I have certain understandings. So in order for us to know something, we have to have a justified, true belief. And those are the 3 aspects of knowledge. Now, because we know what knowledge is, the second question is, how do we get that knowledge? What ways are there for us to know things? Well, there's a couple of different kinds of ways to know things. First of all is knowing through acquaintance. And when we use the word to know, sometimes we use it in different contexts. That's important as well. So knowledge by acquaintance. So what does this mean? Well, it's kind of as it sounds. You know somebody because you've been acquainted with them, right? You know your best friend better than anyone else. Why? Because you've experienced them, you've sat with them, you've talked with them, you understand them. Acquaintance, you know what it feels like to be wet because you've been in a pool or you've been in a bathtub, that kind of thing. That's a specific kind of knowing. Or I know that, he ate that last piece of candy because I saw him do so. So knowing through senses or experience, this is knowledge by acquaintance. This is direct knowledge. And that's one way that we know things. You can know what it's like to sit and watch a podcast right now. A second way to know things is to know them directly, to know that they just are. For example, I exist. How do you know you exist? Well, because you just know. How do you know you're alive right now? Do you have to do a scientific test every morning when you wake up just to check and make sure you're alive? I better hook up the EEG and make sure that heart rate monitors. No, you don't have to do that. You just know. How do you know whether you're in pain or not? It's direct experience, right? You know things directly. And that's a kind of a knowledge by acquaintance as well. But there's also a second type of knowledge. It's knowing by developing skills. It's know-how. So for example, playing an instrument. I play an instrument. And the way I do that is through practice. You do things through repetition. You build muscle memory. Plus you build ideas of what notes sound like when they're put in different spots and how rhythms work. And you develop skills over time. If you're going to build a house, you need to have the know-how to build a house. This is knowing by developing skills. This is know-how. Usually this kind of knowledge takes time. It's developed by practice. It takes repetition, as I said, and it is usually very specific to a situation or a development that you want to apply it to. So there's knowing by acquaintance. There's know-how or knowledge by practice. And then there's knowledge by using our heads, or what's called propositional knowledge. And this is the knowledge that when we start talking about things that we can't directly see or things that we have to deduce, this is the kind of knowledge that we're talking about. And a lot of times when we talk about knowledge, even scientific knowledge, it isn't in a single category. Normally it falls into one of two categories or possibly all three. Nothing is ever usually that neat and tidy. But let's talk about knowledge, propositional knowledge. So for example, we use arguments to deduce new information, right? Let me give you an example. If I said that if in my household pets exist, they would all be female. That's a proposition. If in my household pets exist, they'd all be female. And then I said, I do have pets in my house. What's the thing that you now know about it? Oh, you know that the pets in my house are female. If the propositions are true, right? If the first proposition and the second proposition are true, then the conclusion naturally follows. If all pets in my house are female and I have a pet in my house, it is therefore female. And that's deductive reasoning. So if I have a widget in my hand and all widgets are green, what is the color of the thing I have in my hand? And you can deduce, well, it must be green because you said you had a widget and all widgets are green. Now we have to be careful with propositional knowledge because it's easy to make mistakes. So for example, I'll give you an example. If it rains outside, the grass will be wet. The grass is wet. What do we know about that? Well, we don't know that it's rained outside because what I've done is I've affirmed the consequent of that proposition, that if it rains outside, the grass will be wet. All I've shown is the grass is wet. I haven't said why the grass is wet. It could be that somebody turned on the sprinklers. It could be that somebody spilled a bucket of water. It could be that somebody walked a dog and maybe you want to wash your hand real quick. Yes. So with propositional knowledge, there's a specific form that it has to follow in order to work, in order to be true. But once you have that form, then you can have knowledge because you have a justification for why you believe certain things. That's an important fact. Okay, so these are the three types of knowledge, and we're probably going to spend most of our time on propositional knowledge because most claims begin as propositional knowledge and then they use empirical data as facts, and they'll use sometimes the know-how of the scientist and how he, accumulated that fact. But most of it is interpreted through propositions. And that's why this is important to know. Because if you are, say, an atheist, and you say miracles can't exist, therefore Jesus couldn't have risen from the dead, and in our Jesus Rising from the Dead video, I got a lot of these that said that any explanation is better than Jesus rising from the dead because we know dead people never rise from the dead. And that's bad logic. That's just awful logic. It doesn't follow from that. That's an actual case of begging the question. You're trying to assert what the question is that you need to prove. And that's part of the problem. So when we deal with these things, even in a scientific context, we have to say, what's the facts of the matter? What are the evidence that we have? But what are the propositions that they're trying to make us believe as well? Now, if we're talking about how we know something, another big mistake. Now, let me see if I can do this. Now, if we're talking about how to know something, another big mistake that many people make is they think that knowledge is something that has to have complete certainty. It's 100% true or it's not. And if you don't have complete certainty on this statement, you can't claim to know it. And that's really a misunderstanding of what knowledge is. There are degrees of knowing, and Roderick Chisholm, in his book here, it's a wonderful little book. It's very thick. It's in terms of it's deep philosophically. It's not a long book, but it will take a while to read because it deals with really deep issues. And what he shows is that there are these different aspects of knowing. There's like a scale. So the first would be counterbalanced. There are just as good reasons for it to be true as false. Remember the sentence in Chinese that I talked about. Is it true or false? Well, in your and my view, since neither one of us speak Chinese, we have to say there's as many good reasons for it to be true as to be false. We have no clue. We're just counterbalanced on that. We're neutral, right? And then if you have positive beliefs, then you can know something if it's probable. And that basically says there's simply more reason for believing P than believing its negation. So if I believe something, there's more reason, there's more weight to it. How do you know that that's true? Well, I have a pretty good idea that it's not just faith. There's reasons, and those reasons actually add to its truth value. But they could be wrong. I don't think they're wrong, but they could be wrong. So, for example, you are more likely to be alive in a year from now than to not be alive. It's probable you'll be alive a year from now. Now, there are good reasons for most of us to hold that statement as true. I know I'll be alive a year from now. Well, you can't absolutely know. No, I can't absolutely know, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about general knowledge, and there are good reasons for me believing much more likely for me to be alive than not. Okay? It's more probable to say you'll be alive 6 months from now. You see, because statement 2 is more probable than statement 1, that means it has a higher degree of warrant. And it is considered more probable. It's more justified. And therefore, it has a higher epistemic value. That's a big word that just means it has a higher likelihood of being true. It has greater warrant. And therefore, we hold it more highly as knowledge. But that's just probability. Next comes beyond reasonable doubt. Now, we hear this a lot in court cases and things like that. But what beyond reasonable doubt means, it doesn't mean beyond any doubt. It simply means that you're just more justified believing in the proposition than withholding the belief. So, for example, the screen in which you're watching this video will be here tomorrow. Okay? That's a very... that's not a big claim. That's very normal to believe that the screen that you're watching this on, you'll have tomorrow, is even more likely than you'll be alive a year from now. There's no good or, for example, the United States will continue to exist as a country tomorrow. That's just beyond reasonable doubt. I don't believe that there will be a coup tonight and the whole thing would collapse. And even if there was a coup that began tonight, it's really hard to believe that that coup would succeed in such a way as tomorrow the United States ceases to be. So that's what we mean beyond reasonable doubt. There's just simply a preponderance. There's just simply more reasons to hold to that than to not. Then the next step up is something is just evident. I know the sun is shining because I can see the sun. It's just evident to me, right? Or I know Socrates is mortal. He's a human being. It's clear. We can just see things like that. So to deny something that's evident is like denying contradiction or denying the fact that you're thinking. It's like this is some of the strongest claims to knowledge. You can't deny that you're thinking right now, because to deny that you're thinking requires you to think in order to deny. And that's the problem. And so this is what we see. This is where knowing happens. And then last level is certainty. Those items that are self-presenting. Really, the only things that we can be certain of are things that present to ourselves. So, for example, Rene Descartes, the famous skeptic, was famous in saying that, what if I doubt all these things? What if I doubt that my eyes are telling me the truth? Maybe it's an evil demon. An evil demon was Descartes' view of the Matrix, right? It was his virtual reality engine. He didn't have those kinds of words, but that's what he was saying. What if an evil demon is feeding my senses with things that aren't there? How can I can't believe that I'm walking. I can't believe that I'm breathing. How do I even know anything? What can I lay my foot on that can't be doubted? And that's what he came up with is, I can't doubt that I'm doubting, because that doesn't make any sense. So he turns it around to a positive, I think, therefore I am, and that's how that comes out. But there are other items that are self-presenting. Love, pain, for example. Again, when you're in pain. How about 2 + 2 = 4? That is just simply true. Those are things that are self-presenting. What about all men are created equal? Is that certain? Well, it depends on how you're coming at it, doesn't it? People seem to have a certainty about it, but maybe that's not self-presenting unless you understand that people are equally created with the Spirit of God, right? With the imago Dei, the image of God bearing in them. And if every human being, in order to be qualified as a human being, must bear God's image, then they are all created equal before they all have God's image. So those kinds of deductive arguments you can be certain of. For example, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. I know that Socrates is mortal. That's a deductive argument. The conclusion follows logically from the premises. Well, if all men bear God's image, and this person is a man, then therefore this person bears God's image. He is equal. All men bear God's image. All image bearers are equal. Therefore, all men are equal. So what about God, though? Is God certain? Where does God fit in? Well, Alvin Plantinga held that Christians had a warranted belief that God really shows himself to them directly and immediately. Now, there are other proofs for God. There are other ways that we can inference to the best explanation, cumulative cases for God, and we have other videos that were talking about that. But really, there is also an idea that God really does directly and immediately appeal to me, and I can know it. I can just know it. Now, that's obviously non-Christians will debate that, but it's like saying, you didn't dream last night. How do you know you dreamt? Now, some people can have false beliefs, wrong beliefs, attribute something to God that wasn't God, and you have to go through those ideas. But it's not necessarily the case that because other people have misinterpreted a impression of God, that no impressions of God ever are true. That doesn't follow either. You see why this knowledge stuff becomes important, because when we start teasing these things out, there's always counter cases. Now, that was the positive side. We talked about, all the way up to a certainty, but starting with counterbalance, we can also go negative. There's 6 negative steps as well. Negative knowing means something's probably false, or there's a good reason to disbelieve it in the way that something's probably true. You hold to the same ideas, it's more likely that this isn't true than is true. But that's the reasons we have. And it gives you good reason to disbelieve it. Now, there's evidentially false, or it is beyond reasonable doubt that that is not true. And then, of course, there's certainly false. All of these cases work in the reverse, where you can dismiss claims as much as you can hold them. Okay, so let me pause here for a second, because this is where most people kind of get lost and miss what's really going on. Here's what I need to tell you. If knowledge requires true belief and justification, then here's the question. Can science itself justify the claim that science is the only way to know anything? Remember the Mlodinow and Stephen Hawking quote that I started with. Now think about that. That statement isn't something that you can test in a lab. It's not something you can measure. So is it scientific or is it philosophical? Now, I'd be really interested to hear how you answer that. And if you drop your thoughts in the comments, I'd appreciate it, because how you answer that question actually determines how you see everything else we're talking about. And that's a big part of why we're doing this video. All right, so we understand now what knowledge is. We understand the types of knowledge. We understand that there are degradations or degrees of knowledge. And let's talk, first of all, about what the tools of knowledge are. How do we know that we know something? And there's basically three primary laws of logic upon which the entire scaffolding of knowledge is built. And they seem pretty simple. Each of them are really, we are certain of them because they're self-presenting. But there is no way to argue for them. You have to assume them in order to argue for anything else. So let me give you the three. The first is the law of identity. The law of identity. This is really simple. This means that if you have something with a certain set of attributes, and you've listed all those attributes, and those are the only attributes that thing has, that's what it is. A equals A. In other words, if you have two things that you're describing, if I'm describing myself as the husband of Chrissy Esposito, and I give all of these characteristics, and I also say the president of Come Reason Ministries, and I give all the same characteristics, I'm talking about the same person. I am in front of my camera at this point, at this day, recording this message about knowledge and how it applies, right? If all the descriptions on this side of the register and on this side of the register match, you're talking about the same thing. So, for example, unmarried men are bachelors. A bachelor is an unmarried male. You can use the word unmarried man, you can use the word bachelor, but either way, you're talking about the same thing. For all the attributes that make someone a bachelor, it's the same attributes that make someone unmarried. So it's the law of identity. If you have two different phrases, but you're really talking, they all have the same attributes, you're talking about the same thing. Or how about God is divine? Now, this seems pretty straightforward, right? It's like no duh, you're just using synonyms, but it does come into play down the road, as we will see, because usually what happens is people use different words to try and talk about the same thing, but they don't have the same attributes. Those two different words are actually not referring to the same thing. And that's where the problem is. That means the second law that comes into play is the law of non-contradiction. So for example, A cannot be not A at the same time and in the same way. Now this is a very important idea because this draws the line between what's true and what's false. So for example, if I were to say Jesus is God, I can never say Jesus is God, but Jesus was not divine. That makes no sense. If God and divinity are the same, God is divine, and Jesus is God, then Jesus must be divine. Jesus cannot be not divine. Now, you can argue that Jesus isn't God, and therefore he isn't divine. That's a different argument. But if Jesus is God, you can't argue that he's not divine, because any aspect of divinity is what God consists of. And Jesus, if he's God, he has to have those aspects of divinity. But the quirk in all of this is the idea that there's a justification at the same time and in the same way. And this is where you have to make your distinction. So for example, imagine I'm in New York, okay? And I write a letter to my wife and she says, how are you doing? I said, well, I'm in New York, but really I'm in California right now. Now, when she gets the letter, maybe I'm no longer in New York. That could be a problem. If I call her on the phone and she says, where are you? Well, I'm in my hotel room, but really I'm I'm sitting on the couch with you. That's a difference of not in the same way. So I'm using the term, where am I, differently. I'm in my mind, I'm sitting with her, I'm longing to be there, but my physical location is in my hotel room. So at the same time, if I say the apple is red, and then I come back 3 days later and the apple is brown, I've not made a contradiction. I'm talking about the same apple, but the apple itself changed because there was a lapse in time. Or if I say I'm visiting the apple, I may be visiting New York, the Big Apple. It might not be the same way as visiting the apple that I was referring to yesterday for lunch, that kind of idea. So A cannot be non-A. A is not non-A in the same way or at the same time. That's the key of the law of non-contradiction. A is A if all of the attributes are aligned, but if something is different, then we're talking about two different entities. They cannot be the same thing. And then the third law in the laws of logic is simply the law of excluded middle. It means you have to choose. It's either the same thing or it's not the same thing. Can't be both, right? Either the man is married or he's not married. He's either a bachelor or he's not. Jesus is either God or he's not God. You can't have both of them at the same time. You have to choose one or the other. That's the law of excluded middle. So the law of identity, law of non-contradiction, and the law of excluded middle, these are, again, self-evident. They seem easy, but when we start to explore claims, they become really important because we have to use the idea of rational inference. And again, rational inference is to understand that we can draw conclusions based on the law of identity. So I used the example already that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man. Now, if all men are mortal, that means mortality and man go together. If Socrates is a man, that means he has to have that aspect of mortality to qualify as a man. If he's not mortal, then he's not a man. So if I say all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, you know that he's mortal. But nobody told you that Socrates is mortal. What you've done is you've inferred it from the argument. Okay? And there's a second aspect to this. Because we can make inferences, because we are rational beings, we always hold to the idea that knowing is better than not knowing. In other words, skepticism, for the sake of skepticism itself, is not rationally justifiable. This is huge. This is huge. And this is where a lot of people go sideways, especially with religious claims, because they think that being skeptical means that they're somehow wise or brave. But what they're doing is they're ignoring evidence and they're not holding to evidence. And how does that make you wise? That means that you're just stuffing your fingers in your ears, you're closing your eyes, right? See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, therefore I'm golden. No, it means that you're paralyzed. It means that you're unthinking. Skepticism, for the sake of skepticism, is not rationally justifiable. For example, skeptics can argue, what if we're all brains in that vat? What if we're all in the matrix? How do you know that we're not? Well, I don't have to have certainty on that. I think it's beyond reasonable doubt. I don't have to be, 100% on this, but I'm 99. I'll tell you that. It's just more rational to believe that the life that we're experiencing is the real life. Now, you've dreamt before, and sometimes in your dream you feel like it's real. It does feel like it's real. But when you wake up, true reality has a different texture to it than dreams. And it makes more sense, and it goes more slowly. There's more mundanity to it, right? It's more mundane and all those little things of life. You can tell what real is, and it has that feel to it. It's not logical or rational to believe that you're dreaming all the time, or that your eyes can't tell you what they're seeing, or how can you even trust the laws of logic if people made them up? Well, again, there's just self-evident. How can you even start with anything if you don't even start with the laws of logic? Now, certain truths, as I said, can be known directly, not by other reasons. So, for example, what I ate for breakfast, the fact that I feel no pain, the fact that I can sense the color blue or black or yellow. Not necessarily seeing a thing, but I can even, in my mind's eye, picture the color blue and have that kind of sense. I know I'm alive. I know murder for fun is wrong. And what J.P. Moreland tells us is that when we talk about these kinds of issues, that our senses are prima facie justified. They're innocent until proven guilty. This is what rational people do. They believe what their eyes tell them. Now, there may be reasons in certain circumstances where that wouldn't be true. If you're walking along the desert and you think you see a lake out in the distance, you should beware, because it could be a lake. At the same time, we know that mirages happen, that heat radiates off the desert floor and it looks aquatic, and people have made the mistake of running toward what they think is a water area and it turns out not to be there. Or if we're severely dehydrated, we could be hallucinating. But if those two things don't apply, if you're just driving down the road and you see a car in front of you, you're justified, you're rational to believe that car's in front of you. I better hit the brakes and not believe that, I can go through it. I can just pass right through the thing. It's only an apparition, right? So here's the problem with skepticism. The problem with skepticism says that you should just go through the car. And that's irrational. It's actually irrational to be a skeptic. So the skeptic will come back, though, and say, well, aren't you begging the question by assuming people know these things? And I'm saying, well, maybe people don't understand the laws of logic in the way I've enumerated them. Maybe they can't say them, as three specific statements. But aren't you even using argument and rules of logic to make your objection? So if you're objecting to something like the laws of logic, does it mean that you have to accept my ideas on that certain things like the laws of logic can be known, because you have to use them to even object to the idea that the laws of logic exist? And that's where the hang-up goes. We all have to start someplace. To be reasonable in your doubt means you have to know something in order to compare it with the thing that's being doubted. You must assume some knowledge. And so you can't be skeptical about everything. Okay, well, let's take certain objections. Well, how do you know that? What are your criteria for knowledge? How do you know those criteria can be true? Well, we've talked about it, right? I can know that I know there are certain self-presenting things. For example, I may be on trial for murder, and the DA may be brilliant. There may be all this evidence. Maybe they found my fingerprints on the murder weapon. Maybe they have 3 witnesses. Maybe to a jury it's an open and shut case. But I can know, and I know that I didn't do it. And it would be irrational for me to believe that I did it when I know that I didn't do it. And that's a problem that really plagues a lot of people. Just because it's possible that one may be wrong doesn't mean that it's reasonable to doubt the thing. So maybe I actually did do it. No, I know I didn't do it. I know I've not murdered anyone. I know this to be true. I don't have to doubt it. Is it possible? Maybe I sleptwalked, and that's possible, but it's so far from credible that I can really doubt it. And it's more reasonable for me to hold that I didn't murder someone than it is for me to hold that I did. Okay. We've understood knowledge. We've wrapped all that up. Now let's look at science. What are the limits of science? Well, first of all, we have to realize that when we talk about science today, it gets all mixed up with an idea of presupposition about what is called scientism. Now, what's scientism? It's a predisposed belief that says only science can tell us about the world, right? You kind of heard it from Hawking and Mlodinow. They didn't say it that way. I want to be careful. Hawking didn't say science was the only way to know something. That wouldn't be fair for me to say. But others have. So, for example, Daniel Dennett says, when it comes to facts and explanation of facts, science is the only game in town. Wow. Now, again, Hawking's, traditionally these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Well, these are big claims. By the way, neither one of them are scientific claims. You have to realize that there's nothing that they boiled over a Bunsen burner. There's no tests that they ran there's no data that they extracted by a lab procedure in order to come up with these things. They are making claims of inference based on certain presuppositions. They don't even have evidence that they're making inference from. They're actually biasing their ideology first. And that's the difference between science and scientism. Science says, show me what's out there. I make a hypothesis, and my hypothesis can be very, very wrong. And then the science will say, you're wrong, go back to square one, continue to figure it out. Or it may hold in most cases, and this is usually how science progresses, is it holds for the majority of cases, but there's a few issues off to the edge where the results aren't quite what we expect. There's this errata that keeps showing up. And the more we do it in this way, the more that it doesn't conform. And so what we need to do then is we need to strip this out and come up with something new, right? So the universe is always been here, always will be. Oh, light is instantaneous. Oh, light's not instantaneous. It turns out it has actually a fixed speed, 186,000 miles a second. Well, if light isn't instantaneous, and we see that it's shifting toward the red, that means there was movement. And that means we can, rationally go backwards, step backwards in time and see a point when the universe was all put together at a single instant. So the universe can't be eternally old. We start to, right, as we get better sensitively instruments, if we get instruments that are more sensitive to the data that we get, and as we start to see more errors coming up in our model, we sometimes have to scrap our model and come back again. But there are those objectors. For example, let's start with the first one. There's no such thing as truth. How many of you have heard that? There's no such thing as absolute truth out there. Well, is that absolutely true? See, this is what we call a self-referentially refuting statement. It actually takes its own legs out from underneath it. If there's no such thing as truth, I don't have to believe you on that statement either. But those are the facts. Those are the facts. Well, yes, you may have some facts. Are they all the facts? It was the fact that every force, every action required an equal and opposite reaction, right? Newtonian mechanics held sway for quite a long time until we got into the quantum world. And then it got tossed out because it wouldn't explain anything. Now, it's not that it doesn't work at all, but it is not the overall governing body of all material items. You see, scientism is self-defeating, like saying there's no such thing as truth. Because if you say the only thing that you can know are things from science, and that's not a scientific statement, then you can't know it. You see the problem. Now, science relies on specific things in order to know anything. It relies actually on many other forms of knowledge to function. And this is, again, why Hawking's comment bothers me so much, and why people, atheists especially, who say science is the only way we can know things, really fall into a problem. Because first of all, it assumes certain things, like there will be consistency to the general laws of the universe. That's one of the things that modern science assumes. It assumes that the law of gravity, for example, will pull you at the same rate based on your mass, the mass of the object that's being pulled along with you, divided by the distance squared. So the farther away you are from something, the less gravitational force it will exert. The closer you are, the more gravitational force it will exert, and you will exert upon it as well. We assume that's true. Not only do we assume that's true, we assume that's going to be true tomorrow. That was true yesterday. That was true, at the beginning of the universe. We assume that those aspects of the laws of gravity are the same. The things that we are approaching and that we read back into the history of the universe, we do so because we assume that there will be these consistent laws that have always worked in the same type of way. So there's certain assumptions that are just like, where is this consistency coming from? And of course, again, Christians held that God wouldn't change his mind. He wouldn't change the rules. And this is why Christianity powered the modern scientific engine, because we understood that God is a God of order, and he would have certain constraints upon nature, certain ways in which the world works that we can discover, like these different laws of nature. Science also rests on certain philosophical assumptions, the law of non-contradiction. How do you tell whether the results correspond with your hypothesis or negate your hypothesis? You got to use the law of non-contradiction. Do all of the attributes that I was expecting to see when I did the experiment line up with the attributes I said I would see in my hypothesis? And if they don't, then my experimental data is contradicting my hypothesis. It relies on that. You see how important that is. Also, it doesn't simply rely on philosophical laws. It actually relies on ethical laws too. You shouldn't falsify your results. Now, here's a big issue, because what we're finding over and over again is we're finding more and more people are kind of dropping data that isn't convenient for them and only keeping the data that helps bolster their hypothesis or the statement in their paper. So if you start falsifying results, that's a moral issue, and that's a problem that science has to draw from ethics. Science doesn't live. It's not that science is the king of all knowledge. It has to rely on ethical knowledge. Ethical knowledge has to be there for scientific knowledge to continue. Philosophical knowledge, understanding right from wrong, truth from falsehood, law of non-contradiction, that has to be there for the scientific method to progress. And mathematical principles and values, those ideas of just being able to add these things and see what the results are. All of these things are contributing to what science is. So trust the science. Well, we got to trust the ethics. And whereas the scientist, what's his ethics? Where's he getting his ethics from? Does he believe these things, or is he just simply hoping to make a buck, right? And they could be just wrong. I'm not saying that every bad study is trying to intentionally cover the problem. Many times people are so blind in their biases that they don't realize that they've slanted the sample set. And this is why we see, especially in the social sciences, we're seeing a ton of these things, what they're called, they're non-replicable studies. So they do a study, they publish the results, they say, well, it's most likely that this is the case, X, Y, Z. And then other guys say, well, I'm going to do it again using different people, but recreating the exact same parameters of your study, and my results come out far different than yours. And then a third guy says, and my results come out far different. And then as we start to do this, we see that there's quite a number of papers now, and it's spilling into the hard scientists, where these are non-replicable conclusions. And so the original scientists had a lot of biases. So science can be wrong as well. And matter of fact, the history of science is simply the history of science making a prediction, holding it for a while, finding out that it's wrong, and then coming across and changing it. For example, the Greeks held that the smallest element is the atom. The atom is the smallest thing. And they used that term little bit differently than we started doing so in, say, the 19th, 20th century. But what we found in the mid-20th century is the atom isn't the smallest element. There are quarks. Quarks are the elements that make up atom, right? First of all, there's protons and neutrons and electrons. Electron is a quark. A proton and a neutron is not. It's made up of quarks. So they're actually smaller elements than even an atom. And you have to, scratch that out. There was an idea in the 19th century that there's this ether, this kind of invisible field around the entire universe. And of course, we've shown that that's not true. There is no ether that sits across the universe. The planets don't float on those kinds of things. We don't understand the law of gravity better now. Or that I said the universe is infinitely old. Now, let's look at another problem of science, the myth of, as I said, bias-free science. And again, when we talk about science, it's like people today hold this as a religion. It's like they think, well, science can't be biased because we have the scientific method. Well, first of all, it's not science that's biased. It's people that are biased, okay? And science doesn't do itself. Science isn't just this mythical thing. Science is a way we understand. It's a path of knowledge. It tells us how to proceed to make an inference to the best explanation, as Peter Lythard said. And that's really what we're doing, is we're inferring from what we see to the best explanation we can. But we rely on people to make that inference. And all people are biased. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't recognize our biases, or that biases are always bad, or that we can't learn things in spite of or because of our biases. But there are biases out there. And what you have to realize is many times the scientists who are constructing these studies or constructing these ideas, if your bias is that evolution is true, then you are looking always for the ways evolution produced X. You're never looking for the ways that God produced X. You write that off as a non-starter. And so you never search for that. And then you say, well, how come there's no papers about how creation or intelligent design? Well, it's because you've shut that out. You've started from the biased point of view, and you've never allowed it to occur. That's where these biases prove problematic. And as I said, modern science is basically a product of a Christian worldview. Now I'm going to read, that's what Otto J. Hellwig had said. He understands that our modern scientific enterprise, again, was rooted in understanding the Christian system. Cambridge historian Herbert Butterfield, in his book, The Origins of Modern Science, convincingly argues that what happened in the 16th century and following was not so much a result of new data being discovered, but of changed minds. He writes, while other cultures have given great discoveries to the human race, such as the introduction of zero from the Hindus and algebra from the Muslims, it was the Christian West that had the unique set of assumptions that were required by science. Now, what are these assumptions? He lists three primary assumptions. Number one, the universe is orderly. The world is orderly. That, again, God doesn't change his mind halfway through. The things that were happening at the very beginning of the universe are still the things that happen today. The second assumption, this orderly universe can be known. And lastly, there is a motive to discover the order. God has said, go seek it out, discover it, use it for yourself. The Greek and Roman cultures, they had none of these assumptions. Their gods were fickle. They were unpredictable. Who could know their intentions? You didn't know whether Zeus was going to throw out thunderbolts because he was mad at Hera, because he wanted, a new dalliance to sleep with, or because he didn't like the opposing army. We had no idea. But in these three criteria, it's only a Christian worldview that seems to fit. The created universe is logical. We read this in Jeremiah 31:35. The Lord who gives the sun for light by day and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night. That's, God saying, hey, this is an order to our universe. This is exactly what we expect to see, what Jeremiah saw and what maybe Adam saw before him. Secondly, the universe can be known because the Creator can be known. And Paul tells us this in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. He writes, "For what can be known about God is plain. His eternal power and deity has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made." And then, of course, in Genesis, as I said, God says, "Fill the earth and subdue it." The idea is that man is not to be simply a steward of the world. He is, but he's to be a master over the creation. Okay. Our culture misunderstands what it means to know something. Now, in general, we accept this kind of idea of knowing, but however, when someone wants to debate, they pretend to be a skeptic about knowing, usually only for that subject. Scientists, I think they have a problem. Matter of fact, I think they're being deceptive when they say science has the only keys to knowledge. We know such things cannot be true. Unless you want to dismiss love. Does love not exist? Do ethics not exist? Does philosophy not exist? The problem with these assumptions that science has the only keys to knowledge is it actually takes the things that are the most valuable in making us human. Relationships, virtue, beauty, and it throws them out the window. And that's a huge part of the problem. We don't want to be complete automatons, right? We don't want to be totally logical because we would be machines. We wouldn't be human. You see, science can do a lot and it can show us a lot, but it can't tell us whether it's moral to do those things. Science can teach us how to clone a human being. It can never tell us if we should. So here's the bottom line. Science is an incredible tool for discovering truth, but it was never meant to be the foundation of truth itself. The moment we treat it that way, we're no longer doing science, we're stepping into philosophy, whether we realize it or not. That's why this matters, because if we misunderstand what it means to know something, we just won't get a few ideas wrong. We risk losing our grounding in truth altogether. So let me ask you one final question. What's something that you know is true that science alone could never prove? I'd really like to hear your answer. So put it down in the comments. And if this episode has helped clarify how knowledge actually works, we'll share it with someone who's been told to just trust the science. And also, if you want to go deeper into defending your faith and thinking clearly about the truth, make sure you subscribe and check out the next episode right here. I'm Lenny Esposito. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.